Hey everyone, welcome back to class. In this lecture, we're talking about causality, right? This is this understanding of how our x, or our independent variable, relates to our y, our dependent variable, and how the actual nature of that relationship works. We're going to talk about how we should build our logic of this understanding of causality and create things called causal mechanisms. And we'll also talk about some of the tenets that we should be kind of looking towards when we're understanding the causal relationship or looking to understand the causal relationship between our x and y. In particular, when we're evaluating our hypotheses, right, which are arguments about these phenomena, we are attempting to establish causality. One of the big kind of visualizations that people will give when they're talking about this idea of causality is the image of these sort of dominoes and the domino effect, right? So when you push that first domino, all the other dominoes behind it will fall down, right? So the standing up dominoes fall down because of the force being placed on that first domino, right? So the force on the domino causes, the first domino causes all the other dominoes to fall. This is a causal relationship. We also need to understand the logic behind why that first domino falling causes the others to fall. That sort of logic and that understanding is the causal mechanism. We'll talk about that in more detail here in a second, but that causal mechanism in this case is force, right? Force being placed on that first domino. So when we're looking to establish a causal relationship, when we're evaluating our hypotheses or arguments about a phenomena, the relationship needs to be simple and logical, right? We're going to keep kind of coming back to that you should be honed in, concise, and simple. In addition to the fact that because it's simple and honed in enough, you can state a clear causal mechanism as to why x's relationship is related to y, right? So we should be able to state a very clear relationship between x and y and understand the logic behind that, right? This is your causal mechanism. The causal mechanism in a bit more detail is a sentence that explains the logic behind how and why the cause is related to the effect. So we talked about the language around hypotheses, right? So our working hypothesis is our actual argument, right? The argument that we're making is our working hypothesis. We have an alternative or a null hypothesis that would be if our argument was not to be the case. But our working hypothesis in this example is that as someone gains political knowledge, that's our x, they are more likely to vote Democrat, our y. So our independent variable is political knowledge. Our dependent variable is voting Democrat. So we need to think about the logic of why increases in political knowledge may make people more likely to vote Democrat. You could say this is a fictional example. You could say the same thing if your theory was the same about Republicans. So as somebody gains political knowledge, they're more likely to vote Republican. But you have to be able to state some sort of causal theory as to why this is happening. So the causal mechanism could be in this case that I think that someone with a higher political level of knowledge, maybe they did more, civic classes or government classes in their undergraduate experience, they're more likely to think through the party's platforms very clearly and gravitate towards the Democratic Party's ideas on social programs and freedom of expression. So they maybe went to university, increased their political knowledge, and made them understand the importance of social programs and the importance of diversities of lived experience and being able to express that freely. So that would be an example fictional causal mechanism between the relationship between political knowledge and voting Democrat. Again, our argument would be someone gaining political knowledge, right? An increase in our X leading to an increase or a more likely effect of our Y, which is voting Democrat. And the causal mechanism is the logic, the underlying logic behind why we think that's happening. So in addition to this, we may want to understand how things are related in a more kind of concrete way. So the second tenet that we need to look at in understanding and establishing a causal relationship is that the cause and effect should co-vary, or they should be related to each other. So we'll see this in the next example, in a sort of data-driven example, where we're then going to back out a hypothesis and a causal mechanism based on two variables that we think are associated or related. So our two variables in this example are ice cream and crime. So our X, or independent variable on the X axis or the bottom axis, that's murder rate. So the murder rate in a given city is on our X, and then our Y is the number of ice creams being sold, right? So that's our dependent variable, or what's being caused, the ultimate effect. That's on our Y axis. And each of these blue data points is a given month. So we're not visualizing month right now. We're only visualizing murder rate and ice creams being sold. So in the very bottom left-hand corner, we see the murder rate between 0 and 20% being fairly low, and also ice cream sales being pretty low at that time too. But when you get out to the higher end, right, anywhere between 40, 60, 80, there's a pretty consistent relationship that as our murder rate is increasing, the number of ice creams being sold is also increasing as well. So higher rates on our x-axis are associated with higher rates on our y-axis. They seem to be correlated or related with each other. Now, we cannot say anything about causality yet, and we'll talk about that here, why, in a second. But I want you guys to think about the fact that we could create a hypothesis about this, or an argument. We could say that as murder rate increases, we see an increase additionally, or it's causing an increase in more ice cream being sold. It's a reasonable hypothesis given this data, right? We have some basis for an argument. But then I want you guys to take the next step of that process, which is trying to hone in on a causal mechanism, or the logic as to why increases in murder rates are causing increases in the number of ice cream being sold. And there's really no clear logical link, right? So there's some evidence maybe behind this sort of association, or them being related on a superficial level in this particular data example, but the causal link does not really make any sense. And so that's a good gut check when we're building our sort of hypotheses and trying to move forward, is that if there's no clear or logical link, we might be kind of on the wrong track. And so that becomes a lot more clear in this picture, right? So in this picture, we're still looking at a violent crime index, a murder rate, kind of they're sort of proxies in this example, and ice cream sales. So we have both of these things, the red and the yellow line, but we also have this third variable more clearly shown, which is the month in which this is happening. So we do see that in this case, in the earlier months when it's cold, there's very low rates of murder and ice cream sales. And we see this also is the case in the winter months, October, November, December. But that peak happens when it's warm outside. So both violent crime and ice cream sales increase during the warmer months. So this is why we don't have a clear understanding of the causal mechanism in the last slide, right? Because we have a mediating relationship here, which is really that month or time of year is actually driving this relationship between violent crime and ice cream sales, right? So not only do we need to be able to say a causal mechanism, but these things also need to co-vary in a way that's not mediated by another variable, which in this case was month or time of year, right? The temperature, it being warmer outside. So more people are out and about, they're eating ice cream, they're interacting with each other, more likely to interact with each other in a way that causes violent crime. So this third tenet of establishing a causal relationship essentially states that there can't be an additional third variable that affects the relationship, right? So this was the month, time of year, temperature type argument. These are called control variables or confounding variables. And we'll talk about the details of those particular relationships in the next lecture. But I want you guys to be thinking about the fact that you need to be able to clearly state a causal mechanism. The cause and effect should co-vary, be related to each other, right? but they can't have this additional third variable that's actually underlying and driving the relationship. We should be able to hone in away from confounders or control variables. So let's take this again and kind of wrap it up with an example. So our example argument is going to be literacy rates and gender equality. So a non-directional hypothesis for literacy rates and gender equality would be that literacy rates are associated with gender equality norms. A directional hypothesis would be that increases in literacy rates cause increases in gender equality. A null hypothesis in this example would be that literacy rates are not related to gender equality. Our causal mechanism for a working hypothesis, maybe our directional hypothesis, would be that, so if the directional hypothesis is that there's increases in literacy rates cause increases in gender equality, our causal mechanism would be that increases in literacy rates make it easier for women to get access to jobs and healthcare and education, which thus ends up promoting more equality between different genders in an area. And then confounding or control variables would be anything that we think mediates the ability of literacy rates to cause gender equality. And so this is a pretty solid argument. We could also see that there's additional control or confounding variables, maybe like laws or institutions in a nation that maybe would change the ability of literacy rates to directly affect gender equality. So those are our key terms. Also kind of moving through this module 1C. So we have directional, non-directional hypotheses, the null hypothesis framework, whether we accept or reject the null based on the evidence that we'll garner in our statistical units. You need to be able to establish a causal mechanism for your arguments or your hypotheses. And you need to also be able to kind of start thinking about potential control or confounding variables in these frameworks.